There is another option that doesn't involve using libraries or plugins. You can use loops. As a loop user, you can build a library up, and there are a huge amount of available loops out there. The advantage of loops is that unless you are a skilled percussionist or spend a lot of time programming your own rhythmic elements, you may get better results by using loops. The trick when using loops is to not simply throw a selection of loops together randomly, but to build a collection of useful loops over time and use them carefully. By using a relatively simple loop and adding extra instruments from your libraries or plugins, you will probably get much more realistic results, and it will certainly be more flexible. You will be able to add dynamics and accents with your libraries, while the loops are perhaps used to define the fundamental rhythm. If we listen to the first taiko track, we can hear the regular rhythm. And to aid with this, we have transcribed the loops and made a score here. Now looking at the score, it is hard to hear the 16th notes within the pattern. But one thing that modern DAW software allows us to do is to slow down the music without changing the pitch of the loops. Of course, the loop will sound somewhat strange if we slow it down to approximately half its speed, but it does help us in the sense that we can listen more carefully to the rhythm of the loop. On the score, we can see the dynamic markings, and the loop certainly does have those accents. Now we can play the same percussion group with, for example, our epic toms. I can also record the pattern so that we can replace the loop or layer it, for example. Once again, we can see just how important the dynamics are when playing a pattern into your sequencer. So playing along to a loop with a virtual library can actually help you learn how to create more realistic patterns and of course, you can create your own rhythms by combining your playing with a loop. Also, simply the fact of doubling the pattern with different sounds makes the loops sound better and less noticeable as a simple loop. When playing along to a loop, you may find that quantizing actually works, as the loop will almost certainly be quite accurately played, especially if it is a fundamental rhythmic pattern. You can simply try a variety of quantizing options, and quite often you will find that the loop and your playing align in a musical manner. So certainly when trying to create interesting rhythmic patterns, starting with a loop can help you create something new and original. Now we can see the second taiko pattern and follow it on the score. And again, we can play over the top of the loop. And if I open the keyboard here, you will see that I am actually playing more than one note at a time. So in effect, I am playing the keyboard like a drummer would. You can see that I am playing the second line of the percussion part with my left hand, and my right hand is playing the first percussion line. Now, if we compare to the original loop, we can hear that the rhythm is the same, but it sounds completely different. The sample library has a much bigger sound, and the effect is very different. Obviously, the reverb makes a huge difference, but the interesting thing is that starting from a simple loop, we can end up quite quickly combining different elements and creating interesting sounding patterns. Now we can check Taiko 3 out. If we slow it down though, and listen carefully, we can hear the 16th note pattern at the beginning and the dynamics. At full tempo, it is harder to hear all the subtleties within the loop. Again, we have the lower toms playing steady quarter notes, and the higher tom is playing the accents and the rhythmic element. Then, if you want to play this on our epic toms, it is important to start slowly, so that we can really hear and play with the correct dynamics. You could, of course, input the patterns manually using the mouse, especially if you have the score. But to retain the musical element, it is probably going to sound more natural if you play it in from your keyboard. Now we have Taiko 4. And you can hear it is a slightly more rhythmic pattern, and is certainly an interesting pattern to place a second groove under it. Taiko 5 is another interesting pattern. Taiko 6 has a triplet feel, and I haven't transcribed it. In fact, I'm going to remove it from our arrangement because I intend to experiment with playing a variety of loops together, and it probably wouldn't fit very well if I listened to the other loops I have loaded. Now we arrive at the toms, and we'll listen to tom 1 at a normal tempo. and then I'll slow it down somewhat. Once again, I can simply copy the rhythmic elements and play using my Epic Toms. Next is Tom 2, and here, if we follow the score, you can clearly see the accents again. Playing this one with our Epic Toms is actually quite challenging. You can certainly see how complex some rhythms can be. Now we have 3 sticks tracks. These are basically the drumsticks hitting the rim of the drum. And just with these 3 tracks, we have a lot of rhythmic elements. If you look at the score, you can see that the left and the right hand are in effect playing different notes. This replicates the effect of the drumstick hitting a different part of the drum, depending which hand you are using. So if you replicate this using samples or virtual instruments, it will sound much more realistic when playing more than one sample, i.e. one for the left hand and one for the right hand. The next track is Sticks 2, and here we see it is a straight 16th note pattern. But what makes this interesting are the accents. This will require slowing down quite a bit or quite a lot of practice. But yet again it shows that a pattern that looks simple can inject a lot of rhythm into your music using accents. We can listen to it using the Sticks samples in our Epic Toms preset. Sticks 3 are even more complex. Although the accents are perhaps simpler, it has some 30-second notes in the middle, and this is quite a challenge. Now it gets interesting when we combine a variety of the loops. In effect, much like in Capriccio, we can choose a lower loop, a middle loop, and a high loop. So in the first instance, I'll choose Taiko 1, Tom 1, and Sticks 1. Then we can swap Taiko 1 with Taiko 2. And I'll swap Sticks 1 with Sticks 2. And so on. Even just with these samples, a large variety of different rhythms can easily be created. Of course, you have the option to arrange these in detail if you wish to. It's certainly recommended that you analyze certain loops, however. This way, you can see how certain rhythms are created and use those ideas when programming your own rhythms or playing specific rhythms in. There are lots of small details that add up to a part sounding authentic. And now I have a variety of samples that are already combined samples. So not individual instruments, but complete parts. The problem occurs when using these kind of loops is that it is much harder to mix with them later. You cannot really separate the instruments within the loop. So if you want more reverb on the lower instruments, it's not that easy. If you build your own patterns out of a variety of loops, obviously you can add effects and, for example, equalize the individual elements that make up your pattern. With modern software, you do have certain possibilities available to you to help with this. For example, you could copy the same loop onto two parallel tracks, and high-pass filter one and low-pass filter the other. This would mean that the high end is present on one of the tracks, and the low end is present on the other. You could then add a reverb to the lower end, but not the high end. Having said that, this is somewhat complex, and not always as successful as it could be. Of course, sometimes you have to find workarounds, for example when remixing some music, where the original individual tracks are not available. But in general, it's nice to have as many elements separate as possible to help you when mixing. If we insert an equalizer on this track as an example, I can cut the low end, and then I could play the low end instruments in again myself using a virtual library. So there are many options available when combining loops with libraries. Now we'll just run through some more of our loops. So in summing up, we can say that it is important to have a complete percussion library available to you in a virtual instrument, and you can always enhance that with percussion loops. Almost all of the major DAW packages will come with a large selection of loops as standard, and of course, there are many libraries available from third-party developers. Many of these developers offer free packages of loops as well, so by looking around and choosing carefully, you can certainly build quite a large library without having to invest a large amount of money. And certainly, to get the most out of any loops you do get, analyzing them and replicating them yourself is certainly a good way to learn about percussion instruments within the orchestra. And when you do have a selection of loops, modern DAW systems will allow you to use these loops in tempo with your music, and you can simply preview the loops running in time to your project. Which certainly gives you a lot of flexibility when creating percussion parts.